Welcome everyone to Textiles and Tea with the Handweavers Guild of America. I'm Kathy Group. I'm the Advertising and Marketing Manager, and I'm your host today. Today's Textiles Tea is sponsored by Austin Fiber Arts Center. If you are looking for a place with wonderful fiber arts, check out Fiber Arts. Austin School of Fiber Arts.org. We will have questions today. They'll be the last 15 minutes of the hour, as we always do. And again, please put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. I can't find them in the chat, but we love your comments. Please do that. And I like it when you share things with each other if you have information that others don't have. That's generous, and I like that. Thank you. Today we have Evee Erb. Evee is an internationally known fiber artist who graduated from the Maryland Institute of College of Art. She studied ceramics, illustration, textile design. She now works in a variety of media using traditional painting, sculpting, and of course, weaving. She returned to her home state of North Carolina to work at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And now she leads classes, she gives lectures, she gives art talks. And in 2020, one of her works was included in the book, Woven Together, Weavers and Their Stories. And she was given the honor of writing the introduction for the book. Evee has had her work exhibited nationally and internationally, and her work is in private collections worldwide. Welcome, Evee. It's wonderful to have you here.
Hi, thank you so much.
Well, our first question is always the most important one, which is, what is your favorite tea?
So that's a difficult question because I'm definitely a coffee person. My favorite tea is coffee, but I'm a huge fan of herbal teas. I love chamomile.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with, how did you get started with fibers? How did that come into your life?
So I have been working with fiber, pretty much, I suppose, since I was about like 7 or 8 years old. My first experimentations with fiber were with embroidery. And then when I was a child, my mom taught me how to knit using pencils. And I remember the first thing I ever knitted was like really, really dirty, and it just had graphite all over it from the pencil. And I think my mom probably still has that somewhere. But my mom and my grandmother both worked with fibers when they were younger. And so it's something that they kind of passed down onto me.
Well, I have seen this statement attributed to you that says, I paint my weavings. Now, I know there's some artwork that you have actually painted on some weaving, but I don't think that's what you meant at the time. Can you talk some about that statement?
So I think, part of that for me is trying to delineate, this whole argument between art and craft, and why does it have to be different? Why does it have to be exclusive? What's like the gatekeeping aspect of like art versus craft? Why can't one be both? And I think that that's something that fiber art has battled in the Western art scene pretty much since its inception. And I think that that's something that is rather unique to a Western perspective of fine art. is this whole question of craft and material and utility. And if something has utility, can it still be art? And I think that that's something that weaving particularly combats as a medium. Cloth inherently by nature is just protective, and it's one of the oldest art forms and craft forms in the world, and yet it's not really like adequately recognized or very often recognized in the world of fine art today. And yeah, so for me, painting and weaving is a bit of a commentary on that. I also come from a bit of a background in painting as well. And for me, being able to use weaving as a medium in contrast with paint is a way of sort of like pointedly inserting weaving into the dialogue of fine art and comparing it and putting it right together with painting. And also, you know, this goes beyond like using it conjunctively with paint itself. It's really, you know, you can paint compositions with thread, because painting, when you think about painting as a verb, what painting means, you know, you can create kind of your own language of how do we paint with thread? How do we paint with fiber? What does painting mean? It means applying a material to create a composition, right? So that's something that we as weavers do every day. And yet we're pigeonholed into this whole sphere of craft, of like, you know, low art, so to speak. Yeah, I don't know, that's just something that I am really passionate about, also through kind of a feminist perspective, just as a fiber artist who has inherited a tradition of fiber art from women in my family before me. And, you know, also as a painter, I identify both as a painter and a weaver and a sculptor and all kinds of other things. And, you know, being a weaver does not have to be exclusive or exclusionary of anything else. And I think that weaving as a media provides a really beautiful opportunity for combinations with other art forms and materials and just explorations. And, you know, I get really excited thinking about the relationship that weaving has to painting, because, you know, in many aspects, painting, like contemporary fine art painting, wouldn't exist to quite the degree that it does today if it weren't for weaving. You know, if we didn't have cotton duck canvas or linen, or, you know, these different kinds of like woven engineered substrates that are designed specifically to hold paint and to protect paint, you know, we wouldn't have it in the same kind of incarnation that we do today. And yeah, I don't know, there's so many different ways that paint and fiber relate to one another. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that makes sense. Like the whole connection between paint and fiber for me, it's not just a material one, but also kind of an ideological connection too, in how we use our materials and how we think about our materials, and the way that our own material culture as human beings has evolved, and how can we maybe change that for the better. Long drawn out answer.
No, that's great. And it kind of leads into what I was going to ask next, which is you have a real strong social statement in a lot of your artwork. And I was just curious, how do you find a balance between the artistic and the visual of your piece, the decisions you make there, versus the social statement that you're trying to make? How do you balance those when you're working on a piece?
I would say, you know, to be honest, a lot of it is kind of intuitive when it comes to the visual aspects and the compositional aspects and decision making. It's, you know, again, it's honestly, quite frankly, informed by my experience as a painter and my understanding of composition and light and everything like that through the lens of painting. And yet, understanding how to use that same language with weaving in regards to composition and texture and material. It's just a really exciting difference. And yeah, I don't know.
So how do you start a project? When you get ready to do a work, do you start with, do you do a drawing? Do you draw something out by hand? Do you go on the computer and lay it out? Do you just sample? Because everybody wants to know, how do you start something?
Some weavers would probably tell me I'm a bad planner because I rarely ever sample. Because I'm too impatient and I always itch to get right into it. So I rarely ever take the time to sample.
Me too. You're a woman after my own heart. Yeah.
Yeah. Not that sampling isn't a beautiful practice in and of itself. Like I have a whole pile of samples that I've done over the years that I'm like, how do I use my samples as a material to make something else out of? And but it's really not like a part of my normal day-to-day practice. I do like to sketch at first, and I like to create little like sketch maquettes of different compositions, or if it's like a sculptural project, like you know, trying to understand how it's going to work in a particular given space, depending on like how it's meant to be installed. And that's just another way that I get to kind of combine my materials into the same process. That's exciting. But I think I am always like most excited when I just work really organically and just jump right in. And like, you know, if I see a couple of cones of yarn together that I think like, ooh, this and this, like the relationship between this texture and this fiber and that fiber. I mean, it's just like, that's enough of a jumping off point that I just like start warping and get right into it. So sometimes I plan. I would say most often I just kind of go for it. Yeah.
Well, I can understand.
A little spontaneity.
I can understand that. That's important too, you know, just go with it. Now you're a self-taught weaver, right? From what I understand. So how do you think your approach to weaving, or how do you think not having a organized, structured class to start your weaving career with impacted on you as an artist?
I think probably in a lot of ways, quite frankly. You know, I never studied weaving. I have studied fiber art. I studied embroidery. And you know, the room that I studied embroidery in, I also very briefly took a millinery workshop at one point, just for fun. But the room that I studied fiber art in college, we had a weaving loft that was above my classroom. And I would always see other students like coming in and out, and just, you know, the clicking, clacking of the treadles. And I don't know, there was just something really mystical about it to me. And I was never interested in actually taking a workshop. I think because of my disillusionment with, I guess some of the drawbacks of art education. The reason that I kind of fell into weaving a little bit and fell into ceramics and sculpture actually was kind of a result of my dissatisfaction with art education that I was receiving in the painting department. I initially started my degree as a painter, and then eventually jumped from painting to illustration to ceramics. And then with my ceramics, I did concentration in fibers. And you know, after that experience of leaving the painting department and kind of, you know, trying to find my way a little bit more materially and figure that out, and figuring out my own identity as an artist, I eventually found that like a self-driven form of study and like just educating myself the way that I needed to, and just like really being driven by my own passion for the media and the history, was way more valuable in the end, actually, than, you know, just sitting in a classroom and listening to somebody else tell me how it's supposed to be done or what it's supposed to look like, or this is the history that is being given to you, which often, you know, you look at Bauhaus weaving and everything like that, and that's always like an art school where they go to, which is great. No shame towards Bauhaus weavers at all. But the history of weaving is so vast and so extensive, and there's so much more there. And it's such a rich history, and it's a rich culture, and it's a rich language of art and communication through fiber, that, you know, really, I wanted to dig into it by myself. And I think that, you know, because I am a self-taught weaver, I am a little bit more free to just experiment and kind of do my own thing. And I give myself room to fail. If I try something out and it doesn't work, then that's awesome, because I learned something for the next project, you know. I still like have learned about like different structures and everything like that, kind of like the brass tacks of the practice. But I think that there's a lot more freedom in a self-driven practice that is not just in the studio, but outside of the studio as well, that's really looking at the history of weaving and looking at the ways that certain trends have evolved and the ways that technology has affected it. And it's just, you know, getting to be a part of this history. You know, the best way to utilize that is if you know your history. So yeah, I don't know, it's given me a lot of freedom to explore and experiment.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk to people who've gone to programs that are very rigid of, you got to do this first, and this, and this, and this. And then you talk to someone like you who just figured it out on their own and just kind of went with the flow, and how you both get to the same point, essentially, but that journey is so different.
Well,
and
I think
one
like
is right or one is wrong. They're just so different.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think like, you know, whether you're self-taught or you're enrolled in a program of some variety, you know, to be a weaver, and certainly to be a professional weaver, you have to be kind of just obsessed with it all, you know, and you have to just kind of like eat, breathe, love weaving every hour of every day. And you know, if you've got that love and you've got that passion, then that's all you need.
Well, I think it's fascinating that you have really focused in on several modalities. And so our next image, we've got your sculpture, which is called Luca. We have a painting, which is called Obscurity of the Normal. And then we have this weaving, which is Visage. Now, the painting is the one in the middle. This is a like an overshot that you found, right? And then you painted on it, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how your different modalities that you've worked on has impacted on weaving, or your work as a weaver?
I think, wow, that's a very like multifaceted question. No, I love that, because really weaving to me has such a deep intrinsic relationship with you know, all media. And I think that my time working with ceramics really informed my mentality of like, you know, as you're creating a work, try not to let anything become too sacred. Try not to let anything become too precious, because change happens, mistakes happen, and you never know when the mistake is going to create the magic, and it's going to make that one little moment that makes the piece. And so that's kind of one of the things that like gave me the freedom in the mindset of that, to start painting on my weavings, because like, you know, when you spend that kind of labor and that kind of love creating a textile, to paint on it, like I've had some weavers being like, what are you doing? You know, that's, oh my God. And I'm just like, no, it's okay. I can, you know, I can always weave another one, you know, whatever. And, you know, the moment when the gesso or when the paint touches the fiber, it's always kind of like this, like clenching, holding your breath moment of like, oh gosh, here we go. You know, because once it happens, you can't take it back. And particularly working with oil paint, that's kind of like a point of no return thing. But again, like, you know, that whole practice has really opened a door for me, and understanding, you know, the terminology of like material and representation and form, and how fiber and weaving. I think first off, I should point out that like fiber and weaving oftentimes are two completely different materials for me. Like I will use fiber to create a weaving. I can use fiber loosely in a composition later with paint, but weaving itself, even though it's like composed of fiber, it's a completely different medium for me, where, you know, being able to create something and have it not be the end product, you know, it's not the finished piece, and yet it could be. And it doesn't necessarily like lose its utility over, you know, over the process of like interacting with other materials. It's still cloth, it's still protective, it you know, you could still use it. And yeah, I don't know, it's a very
Yeah,
it's a very multi-level relationship there for me.
That's an interesting point, that you're right. I never thought about, you could weave something just to weave it, or it could just be a step in the process. And you're right. It really could take two different, I don't know, levels or paths or whatever. Huh.
Yeah, and I think there's you know, there's a kind of duality that exists for me a bit, between weaving and painting, and especially like tapestry weaving. You know, those are traditions that are just intrinsically intertwined. And I, quite frankly, I used to like weaving tapestries. I guess like my first like 3 years or so as a weaver, I would weave a lot of tapestries, and now like not into it a whole lot. I'm not quite as interested in it because I find a lot more joy in the serendipity of just playing with structure and playing with like different trottling patterns, and seeing how something like will emerge, even if, you know, like I guess through that lens, like a lot of my final works are actually technically samples because I didn't sample them before. And learning how, you know, that method of mark making with weaving can correlate to the use of different media and different materials is really, really exciting for me. I don't know.
Well, let me ask you something else. Let me kind of shift here. We have an image called Rhythm in Blue. It's one of your works. And in this, you use naturally hand-dyed fiber. And I'm always interested in asking, we ask this all the time of everybody who comes on that does dyeing, because we always get a different answer. Why do you dye? It's a lot of work, but why do you dye the yarns you use?
I dye because I have to. No, and I mean that like, oh, how do I explain that? Dyeing for me is a really spiritual process. It is, you know, kind of like my spirit as an artist and my spirit as a color worker really comes from understanding, where do our colors come from and what is the history of color. And I make my own paint as well too. I've started doing that through the information that I've learned over the years of my natural dye process. And you know, I'm extremely passionate about sustainability, and trying to promote a dialogue within the art world of sustainability. And, you know, just because we're artists and we make things doesn't necessarily always mean that it's environmentally sound or healthy. You know, a lot of folks use acrylic paints that are full of plastic fillers, and you know, don't even get me started on like the fashion industry and like artificial fibers and all that stuff. And it's really just a way of like trying to create a dialogue about how we as artists and we as weavers can use our abilities and use our talents and use our methods to better promote safer, healthier practices for not just ourselves, but for the planet and for the future. And also just like learning how to utilize what's readily around us, and be a little less wasteful. Yeah, I don't know. I'm extremely passionate about natural dyeing. Because to me, it's fundamentally the alchemy of art. You know, you can take raw plants and materials and make a dye out of them and create something completely new. Like, you know, when a lot of folks don't even know that natural dyeing is really a thing. And, you know, I've had so many people come up to me and be like, how'd you do this? I'm like, oh, these are some colors that I extracted from a bouquet that my boyfriend gave me or something like that. And they're like, wait, what? And I'm like, yeah, because that has a whole other level of meaning. And also, you can use these things. They're readily available around you. You just have to like be, you know, mindful enough to take a little extra step to get there.
Now, was natural dyeing something you taught yourself, or was it something you learned in school? Or
I did teach myself, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess
I can
yeah,
see you
I don't know.
doing
I
that,
went on
but
this whole like self-education crusade when I was finishing my degree, and gosh, I'm trying to remember some of the first natural dye projects I did. I had a whole bunch of wool and alpaca that I got from the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival. And for those of y'all who have been there, it's great. You should go. Highly recommend. And it was springtime, I think. And I had harvested a bunch of osage bark from some trees that were actually growing in my neighborhood that were being torn down for a development.
Yeah.
Which was sad, but it was like, I'll try that, because I knew that osage bark was a dye that was readily available. And I mixed it in with some naturally wild forage dandelion, and the result was just like, I was hooked ever since then. I was totally hooked. It was like, I couldn't believe the colors that came out of these materials. And it's literally just magic to me. It's seriously, it's a kind of ritual for me, you know, it's a kind of ceremony, and it's really an act of love.
Well, do you think
know,
living in North Carolina, you have a better resource than some places? I mean, there's so many plants there.
So I do now. I would say at the time when I started learning how to naturally dye, I was actually living up in Baltimore.
Oh, okay.
And you know, my whole life I've gone between Maryland and North Carolina. But being in North Carolina, I do have access to a lot of really great native dye plants. You know, down here we get a bunch of tansy, a bunch of wild growing coreopsis. We get all kinds of stuff. And yeah, I'm just kind of waiting for the pokeberry to come out. That's one of my favorites. But yeah, I think that, like, you know, your natural palette as a natural dyer is very determined by what is readily available around you and what's native to your area.
Yeah.
At least if you're a dyer who forages and wildcrafts that way. I know a lot of natural dyers here who have a different practice of you know, either purchasing natural dye materials or reaching out to other folks who are natural dyers who grow elsewhere in the world, and they can grow their own thing and they can trade, or, you know, whatever. But it's really like a beautiful kind of like, it imbues the place and the landscape from where it was made into the work. And I find that very powerful too. And you could also argue that that's true for the fiber too. You know, if you get, you know, Jacob sheep wool from the British Isles or something, you know, that's very place specific. And yeah, it's a celebration really of nature, of homeland, of you know, arguably life. It's all life.
Well, just a minute ago, you were talking about, you know, reusing and taking what you have around you. I've heard you talk really passionately about recycling and reusing. In one interview, I heard you say that you take nothing and you make it into something. And these two images here are from your work. And the first one is fast fashion, slow death. And then the one on the right is vegetation. And from what I understand, these are recycled materials, correct?
Yes.
And can you talk more about these works and what they mean for you?
So all of my fiber materials that I use are either recycled, which I'll explain this delineation a little bit more in a minute. They're always either recycled or they're naturally dyed and spun by myself. And the reason why I kind of group them into these two categories is because a lot of the times when I'm recycling, or resourcing materials, it can be very difficult to actually pinpoint the fiber content of a material. So the only time that I use anything that is not a natural material is if it's recycled.
Oh, okay.
And so the protest fast fashion slow death was all made out of wool that was recycled. And the vegetation piece was a combination of my own naturally dyed wool. And there's a little bit of naturally dyed silk that I spun in there as well. And the rest is all recycled materials from like post-manufacture clothing. Yeah, I think there's some bits in there that were like from different kinds of fabrics that I cut up, and then the rest was like from an old mill that had shut down. And that's something that like for my, to go back to like the land specific or environmentally specific practice, for me as a weaver living in North Carolina, we were once considered the textile capital of the world. And so all across the state, we have mills that had just closed for the last like 40 years. And so we have a lot of like fiber waste materials here in this part of the region in the Piedmont. And, being able to like include this like kind of like healthy practice of recycling and reusing and education in my practice is something that I've become really passionate about, because it is very important for the region that I live in to be a little bit more mindful of that, and to not just like throw everything out. Yeah.
So are you still getting this leftover material from these mills? I mean, has it just been sitting there for years?
Yeah.
Really?
I mean, there's a lot of it. I will not subject you to seeing my studio right now because it is an utter mess, because it's really just yarn, fiber explosion everywhere. I'm sure there's some folks out there who could relate to that. I thrive in an explosion of fiber, trust me. But really, I would say 95% of the fiber I have is all recycle mill scraps that I've sourced.
Well, I think we need to get a road trip going here and head to North Carolina and get some.
There's a lot,
recycling stuff.
There are, I would say, 4 different places that I steadily source from the most. And I'm kind of at a point where, the amount of material that I have that I've sourced versus like the amount that I can use just myself, I'm not, I'm a one-woman show, I've kind of slowed down a little bit. I went, a couple of years of just like accumulating all these recycled materials that I could, and now I'm just like a little full capacity in my studio. But I'm still constantly trying to figure out different ways of just utilizing these materials and try to raise awareness a little bit about it. And I think that that's something that a lot of businesses are becoming more mindful about too, is, how do we create like better zero waste practices in the fiber and textile industry? How can we use our materials more mindfully and more safely? So yeah, I've got my fingers tightly crossed that continues to happen in the textile industry.
I'm excited to hear some smaller mills are starting to open back up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think they have the waste either that these big mills have, but it's nice to see that happening again. So
when I think, especially in this kind of post-COVID era that we live in, I think a lot of folks are really starting to become a little bit more mindful about just how much labor and materials and consumption we outsource. and, you know, trying to foster a little bit more like local grassroots movements, especially in the art and craft sphere. So, yeah, I don't know. That's something that's been really exciting to see. And I can't wait to see more of it.
Oh, no, it's great that to see him come back. I'm
Yeah.
excited for him. Well, let me shift gears a little bit here. If you were meeting an artist that you admire, dead or alive, you know, you knew him 20 years ago, you knew him yesterday, whatever, what would you make the topic be? Would it be y'all are discussing the meaning of your artwork? Would you be discussing the color of the artwork or the structures that you use? And, you know, who would it be and what would the topics be?
So, gosh, I think I would probably veer a little bit more towards like asking them kind of like personal, hopefully not invasive, but like kind of personal questions of just like, you know, how does this work relate to your life, or what does this say to you, or what memory does this evoke for you, or like kind of asking like sort of autobiographical questions about the individual. And my two picks would have to be Lenore Tawney and Eva Hesse.
Now this first one is Lenore, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So Lenore Tawney holds a near and dear place in my heart. Her work actually was the first all weaving exhibition I ever saw. I was really fortunate actually, when I was studying at the Maryland Institute College of Art, I believe in I think it was 2014, they had an exhibition of Lenore Tawney's work come through in one of our public campus galleries. And it made me cry, seriously. Like I just stood in this gallery crying because of how resonant this work was to me. And I had never seen anything like it before in my life. It was an exhibition of all weaving. And I'm honestly getting a little emotional just thinking about it too, because that the frequency with which that happens is so rare. I mean, with the exception of what was it, the Ani Albers exhibition at David Zwirner a few years ago, and it was at the Tate. You know, Ani Albers is like the one that everybody goes to. You know, Ani's great, Gunther Stoltz, great, Bauhaus weavers are great, but there's a lot more of them that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about, or are kind of underrepresented, or have just sort of been lost in the history of weaving a little bit. And again, you know, this is coming from a Western fine art sphere of weaving, and I want to be very clear about that, because I think that is a perspective which has not always been very healthy to weaving as a medium, a practice, and a movement. And I think it's something that needs to be highlighted a little bit to better prepare for the next generation of weaver artists. But yeah, Lenore Tawney, yeah, she's amazing. I would ask her so many questions.
Now, who's this one?
This is Eva Hesse, yeah. And I hope for any native German speakers out there, I hope I'm not butchering that too terribly. Yeah, so her work actually, she is not a weaver. She's not even really necessarily a fiber artist. So I want to kind of like explain this choice a little bit. She worked in the mid to late 60s a lot with like fiberglass and polyresins, and you know, a lot of like these newer plastics that were coming out at that time that you know, for one thing, people didn't know quite so much about the health and safety of all that. But Eva Hesse actually died when she was fairly young, but she used these synthetic, artificial, you know, hard, dense materials in a way that obviously is very evocative of fiber. And she did use fiber in some. She had a series of sculptural works that were different kinds of nylon ropes that were coated in latex. But the way that she combined materials, I think really inspired me in my own practice of combining fiber with paint. And, you know, really kind of like breaking the boundaries a little bit of what fiber art can look like, what it can be, what it can mean, conceptually, what fiber means to us as human beings, like, and trying to compare and contrast, like, you know, fiber being hard and soft, like, what does that mean? You know, because a lot of her works, especially the ones that were just shown that were kind of stringy, they have like poly resin coatings on them that are hard. They're, you know, they look soft, they look like they're just string, but they're not. They're hard objects. And it really, I don't know, it really gets my brain churning a little bit, thinking about like material culture and what does softness mean to us as human beings? What does softness mean to us as fiber artists and as weavers? And, you know, also just the surprise of like, fiber art can be everywhere. And yeah, I think that for anybody who's a weaver, who's really interested in you know, structure and sculptural applications of weaving, she's a great artist to look at. Yeah.
Well, speaking of structure, I'm curious about something. What weave structures do you find you like the best, and which ones are you just not so crazy about?
I'm the Overshot queen. I love Overshot. I love Overshot. I will weave Overshot till the day I die.
What do you think? Why Overshot? What gets you about Overshot?
Oh God, everything. I love it. I love it so much. I mean, there's so much that you can do with it. I think it's like, to me, it's one of the most versatile weave structures because you know, the ways that it allows you to combine different textures and colors and materials all together in the same composition, for me, is kind of like, that's the painting with weaving a little bit, is thinking about it in terms of Overshot and how do we inlay different designs and structures and materials in this application. And yeah, I love designing my own Overshot. I've been doing my own Overshot drafts for 7 years now, I want to say. And every time it's just like a kaleidoscopic discovery of just something new. You never know what you're going to get, you know, and every time you go into design draft and you start seeing it emerging a little bit and you understand like, okay, if I lift this treadle here or tweak this just a little bit, how does this affect it? And it's just, yeah, I don't know. It's such an organic discovery process for me that just really gets me excited, you know. I like double weave a lot. I have frankly less experience with double weave, but yeah, definitely Overshot, my favorite.
Well, I'm impressed because Overshot's not an easy thing to teach yourself. So if you were teaching yourself that, kudos to you. That's pretty impressive.
I think it's again one of those things of like, you just have to love the tedium of it. Like it takes a lot of time.
It does.
But yeah, you got to be a little crazy and a little obsessed with it.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. Now, you had a clothing line for a while. From what I understand, you gave that up because you really wanted to focus more on getting your work into galleries and doing that sort of thing. Can you talk some about that decision of shifting out of garment making into the other world?
So I think, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. That was actually a very difficult choice for me to make. And I realized that making clothing for me was not as fulfilling as pursuing my own art practice. And being an artist is scary. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. And I kind of just hit a moment where I realized that, you know, in making garments and having a line, I was, you know, kind of taking this energy away from my art and putting it here. And I just became not very fulfilled. And I hit kind of a wall. I had a moment one night where I was just like, I have to stop this. I have to switch. I can't, like, my I am meant to be an artist, and I'm not putting the energy towards that it deserves. And yeah, it was a really difficult choice because I also really loved producing garments and designing. You know, I have sewn my own clothes since I was a little kid. So it's also something I've always been really passionate about, which I think for me as an artist, that's one of my biggest challenges in working with so many different types of media, that like, I just want to do all of the things. And, you know, learning how to organize my time effectively has been a lifelong process. And this was kind of one of those moments where, you know, I had to rededicate and redevote myself to making art instead of making products. And yeah, I don't know. It was a really difficult choice for me to make.
Well, speaking of lifelong, whatever, this kind of segues into, you talked a lot in this interview about your business approach to what you were doing and the business side of being an artist. And I was curious, did that knowledge come from trial and error, falling down, stumbling, getting back up, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I can imagine how hard that is.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, too, with having my own garment line, I learned a lot about it. You know, as valuable as my bachelor's of fine arts degree is and was to me, I didn't get a whole lot of education on like the business side of art. You know, I was never taught how to write a contract, or you know, really like the brass tack semantics of like how to be an artist and also own your own business being an artist. And that was something that I really kind of just had to teach myself and learn along the way. And yes, I did definitely stumble. I learned how to get back up and keep going. And you know, through all of that, I'm really passionate about like trying to be more open and talking with other artists about that, because, you know, I think that that's a really important part of arts education, that it's not the prettiest or the funnest side of it, but it's one of the things that lets us do what we do.
Right.
And I don't think it's really taught often enough. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have a bunch of questions from our audience. You want to take some of those? All
Absolutely.
right, let's start with, oh, this is a great question. Mary Holm, I never thought about this, but this is a very good question. How do you organize your recycled mill fibers? Do you organize by color, by fiber shape, or do you just throw it in a room?
Every time
you don't have to answer that last one.
Okay. So the answer to that is yes, because I kind of do all of them at the same time. Okay. I organize by color for specific palettes for each project that I'm doing. But for general storage, I organize my shelves by fiber type, because, you know, to me, that makes it a lot easier if I'm, you know, kind of in a pinch and I'm just trying to pump something out really quick. I don't want to have to take the time to like do the burn test or like figure out, you know, fiber content or anything like that. I always separate my recycled materials from my naturally dyed and hand spun ones. And I also sometimes just throw it in the room. I don't know. I am by no stretch of the imagination, I'm not the most organized weaver in the world. And for, you know, for any folks out there who've seen my studio, you could attest to that.
Well, Gail Valance wants to know, what do you think of bast fibers like flax, hemp, ramie, and would you add those to your works of art?
I love bast fibers. I have worked with them in a few of my works before. I don't know entirely where it came from. I've had a like package, like a big thick package of raw flax, like raw retted flax. Gosh, I want to say I've had it for like 5 years now. And it's really interesting seeing like the way that it can hold its shape. There's a lot of like structural, sculptural potential for bast fibers, because they are like a little bit more raw, and they have like a different kind of tensile strength to them that makes for these really interesting textural applications, where it's almost like weaving with like monofilament or something. If anybody out there has ever done that, it holds its shape in a way that's like really exciting to me. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, that must speak to your sculptural
Yes.
approach to things.
Yeah.
And Felicity Slavs wants to know, since you studied ceramics, have you ever incorporated any ceramics or pottery pieces into your weaving?
I have. Let's see. I'm trying to think. I would say the best example of that, well, I've done both. I've incorporated ceramics into my weaving and weaving into my ceramics. So for ceramics into my I'll explain that. So like, I guess that means like which material is like dominant. So I've made ceramic pieces to be incorporated into the woven structure of a textile. I have also made woven textile pieces to be incorporated into the sculptural structure of a ceramic. Yeah, so kind of like going back and forth with that, absolutely. I'm trying to think. I made one piece about 6 years ago that I sculpted these little ceramic, I don't even know what I would call them. They're like long little ceramic carvings that I made to be inserted into the structure of the textile, along with a bunch of coyote bones. I'm like a bone lady too. I collect bones. I don't know, but yeah, like figuring out like how to like insert again like hard and soft, and like the contrast of that too is really exciting. And how do you make a textile out of clay? I had a piece that I made for my first solo show that was a textile made completely out of porcelain and thread. So it was these little, for lack of a better term, I would call them scales, like little porcelain scales that I made that ended up creating kind of like armor. And it was just, yeah, sort of trying to figure out like, what is the nature of clay? What is the nature of a textile? How can you create different senses of movement in, a mobile textile structure made out of a hard, rigid material like porcelain that's like so fragile and translucent? And yeah, I don't know. That's something I could talk about forever.
Well, while you were talking, I thought about double weave too, of how you can make little pockets and put things in.
Yeah.
So while you're talking, I'm thinking about my next piece. Okay, I get to double weave and do what she said, and I can add that. Okay, sorry. I know it's about you, not me. Karen LeBlanc wants to know, can you talk about, oh, this is good. Can you talk about funding for any past projects or installation? And what would your dream installation be? And what would it consist of? Great question.
Oh, that's a phenomenal question. Funding for installations, I think that's kind of like one of those businessy things that I've had to learn kind of a little bit by myself as I go. In my personal experience, I, for like a show in a gallery, or for like, an exhibition in an art center or something like that, oftentimes for installation work, there will be a stipend that you're given to help kind of like fund that process and the labor behind it. And that's one of the kind of like additional levels of complication with site specific in situ work. But if I had to pick my dream installation, I've technically actually already done it, but I would do it again, and I would do it differently. So a few years ago, I had a big installation where I created essentially a giant loom out of a wall, and had it be a safe space for survivors of domestic violence to write their stories down on a little strip of linen and weave it in together.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, if given the opportunity, I would love to recreate that installation on a different scale. I would love to do it outdoors rather than inside on a wall, to try to see like how does sunlight shine through it and like illuminate the words, and you know, really just creating like a public tactile visual diary of survival and growth. And yeah, it's like weaving is such a therapeutic practice. And so for me, you know, that's something that I feel very strongly about, promoting the therapeutic aspects of art making in co-collaborative works like that. So yeah.
Do you have any images of that work? Do you know?
I know that I do. I believe they're buried on my external hard drive.
Okay.
But if anybody wants to see it, I'm happy to dig up some of those photos.
Because I'm sure people are wanting to see that. That's incredible. That I love that.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
I don't know if anybody else has experienced having a computer crash.
Sorry.
Which is why I have a bunch of stuff on an external hard drive right now. Yeah, but absolutely, I'd be happy to send out those photos. Yeah.
Well, Evie, you've been wonderful today. I do appreciate you sharing your time and your knowledge and your experiences. And if you want to see more of Evie's work and you are interested in seeing that piece, I know I would love to see it. Be sure you go to her website, which is eveeerb.com. And again, thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful. What a great program.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I also want to say thank you to the Austin School of Fiber Arts. They offer a variety of classes from beginners all the way to they have master level classes. So be sure you check that out. And they also have lectures. And I just saw this on their website. They have Maximo Laura coming to do a guest lecture in September. I don't know about you, but I'd get on a plane to go see that. If you are a fan of his, you might want to go check that out. It's a great school. They just got started. She's doing wonderful things. It's the Austin School of FiberArts.org. If you would like to sponsor Textiles and Tea or your business or your guild, please go to our website at weavespindye.org and get information on how you too could be a sponsor. Textiles and Tea is generously supported by the donations to Fiber Trust. If you would like to see more programming like this, help support HGA by becoming a member or donating or both. And you can do both of those online at weavespindye.org. If you missed part of the program today, you want to watch it again, you want to share it with a friend, remember that all of the Textiles and Tea are recorded and they're on our Facebook page, the HGA Facebook page. I had somebody call me today wondering how they could watch, and they said, I don't have a Facebook account. I don't want a Facebook account. Just a reminder, you don't have to have a Facebook account to watch. And we are putting them on our YouTube channel. It takes a while to get them up there, but we're working on that also. I encourage you to go to the YouTube and subscribe, because when they do show up, you'll get a notice saying that there's a new Textiles and Tea on YouTube. Again, I want to say a big thank you to Evie for joining us today. It was wonderful to hear her talk and see her work. I thank you all for being here. It was a wonderful afternoon. Next week, we have Julie Kornblum. So be sure you join us, and I hope you have a great week and happy tea.